Good afternoon, everyone. I am truly glad to get the chance to welcome you to this webinar, and especially to welcome our distinguished speaker, Professor Thomas Philippon of the Stern School of Business at New York University. The webinar is hosted by the three large confederations of labor, ASI, BHM, and BSRB. I will do the honors of moderating the discussion today. My name is Guðrún Jonsen, and I am an economic advisor to VAFR. We are the labor union of the workers of commerce. But I am also an economist and assistant professor at the Copenhagen Business School. Now, it is safe to say that Thomas Philippon is one of the most influential economists of our time. He holds a PhD in economics from MIT and was recognized by the IMF as one of the top 25 economists under 45 a couple of years ago, to name just one professional honor that he has earned. Philippon has served on the Monetary Policy Advisory Panel of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. He has also served as a senior economic advisor to the French finance minister, as well as served on the board of the French prudential regulator. He has written extensively and done research on things that are highly relevant and even urgent in the public policy debate today, within the fields of macroeconomics and finance, topics that are also relevant to our small country of 360,000, last count, I think. He has done research among other on topics such as debt overhang, underinvestment, wages and human capital, fraudulent accounting, also relevant to Iceland, I'm afraid, and most recently on the state of competition in product markets. As you know, Thomas has recently published a book, The Great Reversal, How America Gave Up on Free Markets. This book has truly opened the eyes of many to the current state of business affairs in the US that few people would have predicted at the beginning of the century. With his meticulous data collection and research, Thomas has clearly shown that a great reversal has already taken place in the functioning of product markets, both in the US and in Europe. However, in the opposite direction, where the US markets have become more concentrated, all the while European markets have become more competitive to the detriment of the American consumer and wage earners, while the Europeans are enjoying the benefits of tougher competition and lower prices. Now, given the tiny size of the Icelandic marketplace, many would say that oligopoly is almost the natural state of affairs here. So Professor Philippon is especially well suited to help us make sense of what it means for people in general when markets get more concentrated or more competitive, and perhaps dig in a little bit of what can be done to keep markets free. Now, Professor Philippon will first spark the conversation with a 20-minute talk. Meanwhile, we will hold off with our questions for 20 minutes. Feel free, however, to write up your questions in the comment section and raise your hand after the talk. We will have plenty of time for questions and deeper discussions. So by that, I hand it over to you, Professor Philippon.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for inviting me. So I prepared a short presentation, which gives a quick overview of the book, but also, the book was written 2 years ago. And so I also want to mention what has happened since then and maybe some discussion for the future. So the theme is to think about the role of large firms, dominant firms in the economy of the 21st century. So we will start with the argument in the book, which is focused on the US. And then I guess we'll move on to more detailed discussion perhaps of recent trends. So if you look at US industries, you see that most industries, not all of them, but most of them, have become more concentrated in the sense that a few firms account for a larger share in each industry. So that fact is not very controversial. But what is very controversial is the interpretation of the fact. The reason it is controversial is because concentration is an outcome. It's not a primitive of the system. It's not a driving force. It's the outcome of economic dynamics. And therefore, it could be the symptom of two different trends. So to simplify the debate, I think it's useful to just call them good concentration and bad concentration. Good concentration happens when, in an industry, the firms that were already the leading firms become even more competitive. So typically that happens because they innovate and spend more on research and development and do a lot of intangible investment, more so than the following firms. And therefore, their market shares grew. And so the industry can become more concentrated, but it's driven by productivity gains at the top. So then when that happens, well, we see higher productivity, that's good. We see lower prices, we see sustained investment. And therefore, from the perspective of consumer, it looks like good concentration. In the US, examples of dynamics that are consistent with the idea of good concentration can be found in retail and wholesale trade, for instance. Now, bad concentration is when the reason behind the concentration, the driving force, is something that looks like a barrier to entry. Okay, it's the business successfully preventing competitors from entering and competing. So when that happens, we see sort of the opposite. We see higher prices and lower productivity. So examples of bad concentration in the US would be the telecom industry, airlines, and the healthcare system. Now, at a given point in time, of course, in a large economy like the US, you always have both going on. Some industries are going through some kind of good concentration dynamics and some through bad concentration dynamics. So the interesting question is not to argue that every single industry is going the same way. The interesting question for me was, okay, on balance, do we see more of the good type or more of the bad type? And the main argument in the book is that until the 1990s, most of the concentration that we saw happening in the US was of the good type. Since the 2000s, bad concentration has become relatively more prevalent. So just so that we are clear about what this means, this is one example of something that's in the book I classify as good concentration. And that's the rise of Walmart, the retail giant. So this is our market share, that's the red triangle measured on the right axis, went from 0 to almost 60% in the span of, say 30 years. So that's amazing in terms of growth. It's very impressive. But as Walmart was expanding, you see that their profit margin measured, so that's the green line measured on the left axis, which is like 6% at the beginning, maybe like 5% at the end. So it's kind of roughly flat, but if anything is going down, not going up. Okay, what that means is that as they were expanding, and their expansion was driven by very, very heavy investment in IT systems, just-in-time inventories, inventory management. As they were doing all of this investment and becoming more efficient, every time they made a 1% productivity gain, it turned into a 1% lower price for consumers, which means that the consumers got the benefit and the profit margin was, as you can see, more or less flat. What's interesting with Walmart as well is that by the early 2000s, when their market share is like 55% or something like that, of course, people are worried. Regulators are worried. In fact, if you read the press of the circa 2005, there's lots of talk about, well, maybe we should do something with Walmart. They have too much market power. Maybe we should have antitrust actions against Walmart. But that never happened. Why? Because capitalism worked. By the time Walmart was becoming really dominant to the point of being maybe like a potential issue, Amazon entered and started competing with Walmart on a very wide range of products. So that's the way capitalism is supposed to work. A firm innovates, makes great progress, productivity goes up, consumers benefit. By the time, thanks to this, maybe this progress that these innovations, but by the time the business becomes too dominant, another business comes in and starts competing. And so the market itself solves the concentration issue dynamically over time. So you could have periods of concentration, but they don't last very, very long, and they don't create excessive profits for very long. Okay, so this is capitalism the way it's supposed to work. But I think it's one description of one industry, but unfortunately, this is not what happened in many other industries. So as a counterexample, I look at the telecom market. The telecom market was very competitive in the 1990s. In fact, that's why I call the book The Great Reversal, because I arrived in the US right there in 1999 when I went to do my PhD at MIT. So I arrived in Boston around, just before 2000. And you can see at that time, concentration is low, markups are low. In fact, I noticed it because it was much cheaper to buy telecom services, that is cell phone plans, internet connection at home, all these kind of things. That was way cheaper than in France. So it was great. But then since then, you can see that both concentration and markups have increased sharply over the following, say, 15 years. So that today, if you compare telecom prices in France and in the US, it's much cheaper in France. So that reversal is, to me, it's a good example of what happened in the US. And if you take a step back and look at the big picture, what I argue in the book is that more industries today look like the telecom than the retail. And that's why I think there's a competition issue in the US economy. In the case of telecom, this is the ranking of the cost of broadband internet measured. So that's already a few years old. But the new data largely confirms this trend. So 20 years ago, the US had very competitive access to internet. It was relatively cheap to access internet in the US. Today, if you look at the cost of a broadband connection, it's more than twice the price in the US as it is in France. So that is, to me, a striking reversal. And it's clearly bad for US consumers. Now, how did that happen? Well, it happens, as we saw on the US side, by growing concentration and profits and markups. But actually, it also happened in reverse in Europe, because Europe is almost like the opposite story. So this shows you here the price of telecom services in France relative to the US. So that's the relative price. So if it's 1.1 or 1.2, that means on average, telecom prices were 10 to 20% higher in France than in the US. And bear in mind, these are non-traded services. So because of the Balassa-Samuelson effect, the fact that the US is richer than France, we would expect non-traded goods and services to be more expensive in the US just because it's a richer country, so wages are higher. But despite that, France was significantly more expensive than the US. Why? Well, because we had a classic oligopoly with 3 providers and they colluded on high prices. Now in 2011, France, the French regulator gave a license and made sure that a new entrant, a 4th telecom operator, could enter the cellular market. And it was aptly named Free Mobile. So Free Mobile entered, cut prices in half in 6 months, literally. So for the same contract that was proposed at 40 euros per month by the existing oligopolies, Free Mobile offered the same contract at 20 euros per month, starting a price war because the other guys had to respond. And in a span of a couple of years, France went from being something like a relatively expensive place to get a cell phone and especially like data plans, to a place where it's actually very cheap. Today, it's less than half of the price of the US. So that shows that policy works both ways. Bad policy can have bad effects, but good policy can have good effects. Okay, so now if you, again, we focus on one industry to understand what's going on, but let's open up the perspective and think about broadly speaking. So what I do here is I try to compute for the typical industry, if you want, for the, broadly speaking, the baskets of goods and services that the median households buy in the US. How much more do they pay than they would pay in a more competitive market, or they would pay in another country that's more competitive, or that they would pay if the US had remained as competitive as it was in the past? Now, just to be clear, this thing does not include healthcare services, because healthcare services are such a complete disaster in the US that it's literally impossible to create a benchmark that you could use to compare to other countries. So that's not even included. And then that's a lot of money on top of it. Okay, so I'm not even counting that. This is the rest. So telecom, some healthcare, but not the big healthcare services. Okay, so what you see is that in Europe, these markets have been roughly flat over the past 20 years, where in the US they've gone up. So today, this gap here is somewhere between 7 or 10%, depending on, as you can imagine, the measurement is very complicated, so there's a range. But roughly speaking, prices in the US are about 7 or 10% too high. Okay. Now, how much does that mean in terms of consumer welfare? So that corresponds to about $300 per month for the median household, which literally means that if the market had remained competitive, the median household should end each month with an extra $300 in their pocket of free cash. That's a lot of money, because the surveys we have in the US show that many households think that it would be very hard for them to cope with an expected expense of a few $100s. So they have very little liquid savings. So another $300 per month is actually a big deal for many people. If you aggregate over 12 months and over all the households in the US, that's about $600 billion. So that's every year the amount of extra profit that is made by firms, or if you want, the extra spending that consumers make, that correspond to rents, monopoly rents by US businesses. If you think about what would happen in an economy if the US economy had remained as competitive as it was, then you have to take into account other feedback loops, which is if an industry becomes more competitive, it changes its behavior. It hires more, it invests more. If you put all these pieces together and you simulate what would happen in an economy using the standard model we have in economy, then the prediction would be that US private GDP would go up by about $1 trillion, which is, US GDP, private GDP is about, say, 20 trillion. So 1 trillion is 5%. So what I'm saying is that because of lack of competition, the US economy, the private sector is about 5% too small. So we should have an extra 5% of GDP. What's even more interesting is that, so that's for the GDP, that's a total pie for the economy. But of course, product market trends affect not only the size of the pie, but also the sharing of the pie, because profits are higher, therefore wages are lower. That's exactly, it's two sides of the same coin. So when I simulate an economy which is more competitive, profits go down and wages go up. So together GDP goes up by about $1 trillion, but in fact, there's at least $250 billion of redistribution on top of it. So if we were to go back to high competition, then dividends and share buyback would drop by about 250 billion, and labor income would go up by about 125 trillion. So now, if you look at the median household, which in the US is a household earnings about $50,000 per year, Most of their income is labor income. They don't have a lot of wealth invested in the stock market. So for them, the drop in profits and dividend would not be a big deal, but the rise in labor income would be a big deal. So if you actually simulate what that means for the median household, it's more like it's almost a 10% increase in their standards of living. So that's, I think, in terms of consumer welfare, is a big deal. Okay, so that's kind of the main argument in the book. Now, I'll be happy to talk about why it happened in the US. The book talks a lot about the political economy of antitrust and regulations and all of that. So very happy to talk about that in the future. How do you actually regulate monopolies? How do they get so much political clout? We can discuss all of that. But I thought that in the last 5 minutes, I would just give you more like my view on something else, which is in the news a lot today, which is the Google, Apple, Amazon, Facebook, like the stars of the internet today. And I just want to convince you of one thing, which is these firms are great, but they are not exceptional. So the first thing you hear a lot is, well, these firms are amazingly big. That actually is not true. So the reason people get confused is they do the following. They take Apple, for instance. They take Apple and they look at Apple consolidated worldwide revenues. And then they divide by US GDP. If you do that, you find that relative to GDP, Apple is pretty big, about as big as AT&T was at its prime in the 1950s or 60s. But AT&T had essentially 100% of its revenues from the US. So of course, at that time, it made sense. You compare revenues of AT&T to US GDP. But Apple's revenue, less than half come from the US. More than half of Apple's revenue come from abroad. So when you're comparing Apple to US GDP, half of it is from outside the US. So therefore, you should be doing one of two things. You could do either domestic revenues of Apple relative to US GDP, in which case you would find Apple is not very big compared to the big firms of the past. Or you could do consolidated revenues of Apple worldwide, but then you divide by world GDP. Okay, but what you cannot do is mix, a domestic measure and a global measure. If you do either of these, that is either domestic over domestic or global over global, you don't find that these firms are very large by historical standards. So, and definitely you don't find that they've increased a lot since 2000. So this is showing you the global comparison. So this figure has 3 lines. The green line at the bottom is the top 100 firms in the world. So this is literally the 100 largest businesses in the world from all countries. Of course, like maybe 50 of them are American, as you can imagine. So you have like a lot of American, some Europeans, and some Chinese, and some Japanese. Maybe a few Korean, but so still there's a lot of American firms. But this is just the largest 100 businesses in the world by total annual revenues. You add up all their revenues and you divide by global GDP. What you can see is that in the 1990s, that was going up actually. But since 2000, it's either flat or going down. This is for the top 100. This is for the top 500 at the top with the circles. In the one in the middle is doing the top 20 by industry. Because if you select the top 100 firms in the world, from one decade to the next, the composition of industry is going to change. So maybe you're mixing something about a shift in industry composition with a shift in firm dynamics. So if you're worried about that, you can neutralize that effect by not selecting the top 100 businesses or 200 businesses. Just fix the set of industries. For each industry, you look at the top 20. So now you're by construction holding the composition of industries fixed. That changes nothing to that picture. That's the blue line you can see. So the trends are exactly very similar. So there was definitely some growth in the 1990s, and I think that actually was good concentration. But since 2000, it's just not true that these firms are being growing a lot. So they are not very large by historical standard. Another way of saying it is, yes, Apple is growing fast, but so is China. So just if Apple has a constant market share in China, given how fast China is rising, then Apple is going to rise. So the growth rate of Apple should be like half of the growth rate of the US plus half of the growth rate of China. So of course, as a share of US GDP is going to grow, but that's not telling you there's something amazing about the company. So that's the first point. These firms, contrary to what people say, are not as big and definitely not getting much bigger in terms of their size. The second thing is the winner-take-all argument, which is, oh, we live in a world today where it's all winner-take-all. So, we're going to be dominated by there's going to be one winner per industry. Maybe, but what's striking is people who make that argument never look at the data. So if you look at the data, you don't find that. So this is showing you here the relative market value of the top firm versus the second firm for each industry. Okay, so that's the green line. And the red line is the top firm versus the average of 2, 3, 4, 5. So let's focus on the bottom one. I mean, you can see they give you similar trends. So these are log differences. So if you want, if it's like 0.5, that means that the largest firm in an industry is typically 50% bigger than the next one. Oh, and I think this is by market value. So this is the market value of equity. Okay, so that's a lot. I mean, there is no denial that in economics, typically we call that a distribution with fat tails. That is like, the distribution of firm is such that the most valuable firm is a lot more valuable than the next one. Okay, that's always been true. So this 50% or 100%, that's a big difference. Okay, that's the distribution of firm profitability is very skewed. But what's striking is it's not going up. So either the statement is winner take all has always been a feature of capitalism, or it's never been a feature. But the statement is certainly not that we live today in an unprecedented world of winner take all. That's just not true. Last point, productivity. So you hear a lot, okay, maybe let me go to that one. You hear a lot that these firms are amazing, but of course that doesn't mean anything because you're focusing on the firms that are most successful by definition. So the question is, are they amazing compared to what? Now here, of course, it's a bit tricky because most of the book, I compared the US and Europe. Now, that works very well for almost every industry except the big internet platforms, because there is no equivalent of Facebook or Google in Europe. There is in China, but China is very hard to compare. So what I do here instead is I compare the stars of today to the stars of the past. Okay, so what you see here is for each year, we select the most successful firms in the US, the top 100. And then we look at how much they are growing. And now their growth, in turn, there's two ways to think about their growth. You can think of internal productivity growth. That's the green line. It's called Halton because it's the name of the economist who gave his name to the theorem that allows you to make this construction. So this green line is the contribution of productivity growth for the US economy coming from the top 100 firms, from their internal productivity. So that's saying like, imagine, so say like IBM. Okay, IBM was the dominant firm of the 1970s. So IBM has a bunch of employees in 1 year. The next year that they have the same number of employees, but they produce 10% more. Okay, that's 10% productivity growth for IBM. Now you multiply by the right measure of size of IBM and you see what it does to the US economy. If you do it for the top 100 firms, you get this number here, 0.5%. That's a huge number because that's just saying that a full 0.5% of the entire productivity growth of the entire US came only from the top 100 firms. So it's a huge contribution. And you can see this green line is kind of flat, but since 2000, it's been, if anything, lower than before. In fact, the recent years is close to zero. So if you benchmark the productivity growth of today's star firms by the stars of the past, you find that the stars of today, in fact, are not growing as much as the one from the past. They are not generating as much productivity growth. Now, the other thing that's important for growth, of course, is reallocation. So it could be that IBM was, say, 20% more productive than the next firm, maybe IBM is not getting more productive from one year to the next, but they hire more people. So you relocate capital and labor towards more productive firms. The firm itself does not become more productive, but if you reallocate towards more productive firms, then the economy gets more productive. So that's what we call the reallocation contribution. Typically, it's positive as well. So that means that more productive firms tend to attract more resources, which is good. So it contributes to productivity. The blue line is the sum of the green and the red. Okay, so the blue line is the total contribution of the dominant firms to the growth of the economy, both through their internal productivity and through the reallocation effect. And you can see that that's a big number. The thing that's amazing when I did this graph first is in the 1990s, it was 1.5% per year of productivity. I mean, that's like, today, if we have 1% total, we are happy. This is like in the 1990s, just the top 100 firms created 1.5% of productivity growth per year. So that's amazing. And it came half from the internal and half from reallocation. In recent years, internal has been pretty mediocre. Reallocation has picked up a bit. So if you do the sum, you get the blue, which is positive, but it's not as impressive. It's maybe less than half of what it used to be. So the bottom line here is that although Google, Facebook, and Amazon are impressive businesses, very successful, they are not amazing by historical standards. We used to have great firms in the economy. We always had dominant firms, and they were always very big and making a lot of money and a lot of productivity. By these standards, the new ones are just okay, but not that impressive. I think it's important to keep in mind when you think about antitrust actions and stuff like that. These are not amazing firms that we should be worried about. If we do anything against them, we're going to break the whole engine for growth. That's just complete BS. Okay, these are normal firms, great firms. Like we had great firms in the past, but if great firms misbehave, we do antitrust against them, just like we did in the past. There's nothing new here. Thank you very much. I'm happy to have questions.
Thank you, Thomas. It's actually quite tempting to push for the point that, given the fact that the large firms have such a big contribution to productivity growth, I'm out on a limb here, but does that have anything to do with fraudulent accounting? Do the smaller firms have more leeway in sort of cooking the books, if you will, and distorting the aggregate numbers?
No, I think you can say the big firms, they do have more political clout, so they get special treatment, trade deals. Of course, when you have a trade deal, then the big firms are going to have more political weight to get the deal they want. If you look at some programs of, say, R&D subsidies, especially in continental Europe, they are captured by the big firms. So that's a bias that favors them. In the US, though, the US typically was pretty good at making sure the small firms also get credit. I mean, there is like the whole small business administration, making sure that procurement contract, that's a super efficient tool. System. So I don't think historically the US has been particularly biased towards big firms. In fact, historically, the US was the country that was the most, starting with Teddy Roosevelt, that historically the US has been the country that was the most uncomfortable with firms that are too dominant. And that's part of the reason when the US took over Germany after World War II, they broke down all the conglomerates to try to make the economy a bit more competitive. And also just because they didn't trust the political power of the big firms, and for good reason, actually, given the mess they had made. So in the DNA of the US, there is the idea that businesses should be great, but they shouldn't be too powerful. I think that's I think that's what we are rediscovering today in the discussion with Amazon and Google, Facebook, and Apple.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are mainly good news. There's mainly good news that you bring forward, especially on the front that people have the inclination of believing that we will all be employees of Amazon one day. That's for sure. But you, if I quote from your book, keeping, and I remind those who are listening in, please let me know if you want to state your question or write your question in the chat here, and I can pose it for you either in Icelandic or English, not in French.
Yeah, if it's in Icelandic, I'm afraid I will need a translation.
You could take the French ones. But so if we just dwell on the messages that you bring forward in the book that I feel are very hopeful and also reminding us of keeping our wake or stay awake at the wheel. You say here, keeping markets free requires government intervention. And you further state that markets are not free while regulation is weak and oligopoly persists. And again, it's tempting to, I mean, we would like to have you, or I would like to have you for much longer time and discuss the book, but it's really tempting to have you think about a small open economy like Iceland. We are 360,000. It's like Chapel Hill and Durham combined. But it's the small population, therefore economies of scale is not easily attained. Mm-hmm. Now, in your view, is the Icelandic population therefore destined to pay higher prices for goods and services compared to the rest of Europe? Or is there any way for the Icelandic public to protect itself against this wealth shift that you so clearly described from workers over to oligopolists? What can the government do to keep the markets free?
Well, I think being a small open economy is both a curse and a blessing in that sense. So my big picture answer would be that I don't think that you being small, I don't think in today's world is bound to have a big effect. It's more that you can have the good policies whether you're big or small. Now, the policy would be a bit different. It's true that the trade-off is pretty obvious. If you're small, then you cannot have many firms in many industries. You cannot have many firms in all industries. That's obvious. Okay. So clearly, in fact, the old trade models were built around that idea. Like if you look at Krugman in 79, then it was all built on this idea that, okay, you have scale effect. So, the bigger the country, you can produce more varieties for people. So the baseline prediction would be that in a small isolated country, people would have fewer choices. And I think that was very true in the data. Now, of course, with trade, you benefit, if you're a small country, you benefit more from trade. So what you need to do, obviously, is to play the trade card a bit more. And so if you worry that some domestic industries are have too much market power, then the best solution is to bring in competition from abroad. So trade policy becomes strategically more important. I think that's pretty obvious. But I think it's more like the political economy. So, but to be clear, so if you did that correctly, I don't think it would end up looking very different from a big country. A small country with a smart trade policy can get the same level of competition as a big country, I think. The thing is that the political economy is a bit different because, and perhaps could be more difficult. Because I think, in theory at least, domestic competition is a bit easier to sell because the winners and losers are in the same country. Foreign competition, there is always the danger that the winners and losers are, some of the winners and losers would be in different regions or different countries. So the politics of it can be a bit more tricky. But it's not clear which way it goes necessarily, because if you don't have too many large firms, they're also less likely to capture the politicians. And if you want to bring in competition from abroad as a domestic politician, it's pretty easy to play one foreign company against another foreign company to make sure they compete. So again, I don't think you're doomed to have higher prices. Now, of course, you still have transport costs. So I guess one big thing in Iceland is the stuff you need to import. There's a transport cost. So that when I talk about markups, it's net of transport costs.
Yeah, sure.
So the fact that because you need to import so many goods, they are 20% higher because you have to import them. That I would never count as a markup. It's just that's the fact of life. If it's on top of it, they put your markup. That's when the trouble is.
Yeah. So concentration in the meaning of a dominant firm, so single dominant firm that is likely to both capture politicians or regulators and and the markup is the danger. So if you have and can basically have a control over the prices in the market. So there's a question from Gylfi Magnússon, former chair of the competition authorities and economics professor. So I'll read it out. I think it's best. Can we conclude from this that it is not a major economic concern for Europeans, that they do not have any companies that are comparable to Google, Apple, Facebook, etc.? Even so, is it not a matter of concern that these non-European companies more or less control how Europeans communicate and get their news and other information? So there's the political.
Yeah. So that's, first of all, that's a great question. And I've been talking to various people in Europe about that question for, like, as you can imagine, quite intensively for the past 2 years. So there's a lot in that question. So I think it's important to unpack a little bit. So the first thing I would say is that, yes, it is a problem for Europe. But we need to be a bit precise about what the problem is. So the first thing is it's a symptom, which is that the book is not bearish on the US. The book is just saying, look, the US used to be great at having competitive market that was great for the middle class. They forgot it. The middle class is getting ripped off by monopolies. They can fix it. But that's one dimension of economic performance or growth. I mean, if you think about the broad spectrum, to have a well-functioning economy, you need innovation. In today's world, it's research. So that in having a good cluster of private and public research, universities together with firms, that's very important. Clearly, the US is still the best at doing that, although the Chinese are catching up quickly. But like this ecosystem of having research universities linked to firms and pushing innovative products, that's what you see in Boston, in New York, in Chicago, San Francisco, you see in Texas as well, actually. So that's great. The US is still the best at doing that. Second, you need funding. And there is no question that the US is still the best. Like the VC market, the VC from all stages of venture capital all the way to the stock markets, the firms in the US that have good ideas get funding very quickly at very high scale. The US is still the best there. And finally, the US has one market with 300 million people in it. And that is, if you get your product approved, you immediately can reach 300 million people. On these 3 points, Europe is still way behind. And so when I talk to policymakers, I said, you still have a lot of work to do there. Like one of the main reasons we don't have Google, Facebook in Europe is because we had some ideas that could have merged into this, but they would never have the same scale because the market for services in Europe is still very segmented. So, the reason that the Chinese could do it is because, well, A, they put barriers to prevent the ones from entering, but also because as soon as Alibaba was set up, it got 1 billion customers, like literally. So, that's not true in Europe. If you have a brilliant entrepreneur in Portugal who has an idea with something that could look like a social network, by the time he reaches Finland, see what I mean? Like it's not immediately a big market. That's the problem we have. So we need to fix that. So that's the first thing. So there, it's not so much that the fact that we don't have Google and Facebook in itself is bad. It's a signal, it's a symptom that we still have much work to do. That's the first thing. The second thing is these firms are special in the sense of their use of data, of their impact on privacy, and their impact on politics. So of course, that's not true for Apple to a large extent, not very true for Microsoft either. So the fact that we don't have Apple and Microsoft, to be honest, I don't care. I mean, I think the Americans are better. I don't see why we try to reinvent the wheel. The great news, of course, is Korea. That is, thanks to Samsung. I mean, think of it that way. Suppose you're in Argentina, and you're in the 1970s and or 60s, and the Europeans decide to launch the Airbus project. You're like, great, I used to have one choice. I had to buy Boeing from the US. Now the Europeans want to invest a lot of money so that they can compete with Boeing. Who benefits the most? Everybody else in the world. Chile, Argentina, India, all these other countries are like, great. So now they have two choices. Now, of course, the returns to scale are so huge, there's not that much space to maybe create a third one, but they don't really care, So they benefit from that. Now, what's happening in the telephone market is the same thing. Samsung is competing with Apple, and we all benefit. So, I'm fine with that. Now, it's true that for the social network, you have the issue of the interaction, which is with society and with politics. And that can be toxic. And there is a cause for concern. But so I'm more in favor of something specific there about data protection. But I think on that one, Europe has tried to move forward and has done some progress. So that's good. The last thing is, for these guys are big monopolies, so they charge markups to everybody, but they mostly benefit. But even that, actually, that's a bit misleading, for instance. Like, if you look at the ownership of Apple and Google, these are widely held companies around the world. So it's not even true that all the benefits from their global markups come back to US people. They come back to Apple shareholders, and the Apple shareholders are going to be rich people from around the world.
With different ranked shareholders, though.
Sure.
Yeah, but still. But there may be a revolt at some point. Yeah.
So the last thing I want to say, though. So just to be clear, I think that the fact that we don't have companies like that is a symptom that we need to make a lot of progress on innovation, universities, funding, and access to market for Europe. We haven't achieved this, and that's a big deal, and we should do it. On the data side, data privacy, I think we should have specific regulation that are pretty harsh on this, because I think it's important for us. The last thing, though, is when I talk to policymakers in Europe, is sometimes I get a bit annoyed, because sometimes I almost feel like they use Apple and Google as excuses. Because, of course, if you say, you throw your hands and say, oh my goodness, we don't have Apple and Google. Well, there's no way you're going to get them. You're so far behind. Like, what are you even talking about?
Right. It's not,
but then it prevents them from talking the stuff that they should be doing. So when I go to Italy, I ask them, forget about Google. Why don't you have Starbucks? You guys invented espresso. When Starbucks was launched in the US, they didn't know how to make coffee. They went to Italy to buy the machines and the expertise. How come you guys did not invent Starbucks? Then I go to Germany. You know that Tesla is $600 billion of valuation? That's more than the combined value of all of your car manufacturers combined. Tesla. So the shame of Germany is, how come Tesla is not a German company? That's what they should be thinking. See, and for France, to me, is agriculture. The fact that France is not at the forefront of all the new revolution in food production, that is going to happen. Like, our kids are not going to eat the same meat that we eat today. They know that's for sure is going to happen. The fact that France is way behind on that, I think that's a shame. That's the thing they should be worried about, much more than Google.
Exactly. If we shift gear a little bit, so in your book, you describe the harm and benefits resulting from lobbyists or public advocacy of special interest groups. Can you reflect a little bit on that? And more specifically, where do you place broad alliance of workers on one hand and the alliance of large employers on the other hand in that discussion? So how do these entities contribute to the distribution of wealth and welfare in your view? We are having a very weird discussion, in my view, here in this country, placing the workers' unions as these strong special interest groups that represent probably more than 80% of the population.
Yeah, so that actually is something which is dear to my heart, because one of the first book I wrote, before writing this big book, I had written a small essay in France on social dialogue and particularly the interplay between unions and firms. And I follow this thing quite closely, also because I'm also on an advisory panel for the next G7. And so I was actually reading and talking to union members about the L7, the labor union party. So, I mean, let's be honest. Historically, the L7 has always been very weak compared to the G7, which is the government, even the B7, which is the business. So, you know, cross-border cooperation has always been difficult for unions historically. I mean, there was the international movement, but it was always a tall order. So if you move to a more globalized world, almost mechanically, you move into a world where it's structurally harder for unions because that's not their comparative advantage. They are just not that good at doing the cross-border stuff. So I think that's one effect. And then you have very large differences across countries. And the US is probably the country where the decline of the labor movement is the most striking because it was quite influential in the past. And it has lost its clout to a very large extent. Well, it's changing a tiny bit with the Biden administration, but it's still, you know, now why is that? There are so many factors. But I don't think necessarily that it's inevitable. I just think that the unions have been pretty bad at reinventing themselves for the 21st century. They remain very conservative. They haven't been able to seize on the new opportunities and dynamics of what young people actually want. And the traditional model of the blue collar union is just not something that's going to work for the 21st century. And so I think that there was a lack of. Now, on the other hand, if you look at Northern Europe or Germany, that's different. They've managed to keep up a lot more, and they clearly offer a better model for the future. So now the role they can play, of course, depends a lot. Personally, I think that models of co-determination is still something that's very appealing to me. So the idea that you need cooperation and that unions can be very useful in promoting social dialogues and welfare within firms, I think it's super important. I'm a bit more suspicious of public sector unions because to me, the public sector union they are much more likely to be very partisan and they protect people who are already very well protected. So even the rationale for that, I don't understand. Well, the people who need protection are people who are in the service sector, in the private sector, you know, people working long hours in stores or warehouses. These are the people that I think are much more exposed. People who work in the public sector, I don't really think they need that much protection. And I think that in the grand scheme, it is also, that's part of the issue because the public sees public sector union and sometimes making very unreasonable demand and that destroy the trust, which would have been useful for the unions in the private sector, actually. So I think to me, these are and if you put all these pieces together, I think that explains quite a bit of what you see in different countries, how they manage to do that. The fact is, what's striking in Germany is that most of the big unions we think about, they're all private sector unions. Mm-hmm. And they derive their legitimacy from that.
Exactly. But if you hone in on the true special interests, the ones that go after individual policymakers and have them change the laws in favor of them, so what are the tools out there to keep our guards against them and minimize the harm that is done by lobbyists, recognizing that there are benefits also to be had to hear the experts' opinion.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's not that complicated. To me, lobbying is just it's a classic issue of balance of power, you know, of equilibrium. So it's good to have lobbyists because that's their job is to provide information. Of course, the information they give is biased in their own favor, but it still could be useful. And you just need to have a balance so that they don't have too much clout. The problem of the firms in the US now, the big ones, is they've become so big and so profitable that they have a lot of money to spend. That's the vicious circle, which is once your monopoly rents are big enough, A, you have a big incentive to protect them, and B, you have a lot of money to protect them. So then it becomes self-fulfilling. So I think that's the issue. Now, how you prevent that? Well, first of all, you keep the market competitive. So I think antitrust is good for that, or regulations. And specifically in the US, the problem is at the level of the elections. The fact that there's unlimited, the fact that campaign finance is so poorly regulated in the US, I think that's the issue. I don't think the lobbying necessarily is worse in the US than in Europe. In fact, for a long time, it was much more transparent here. The requirement for transparency was higher in the US, was better than in Europe. But the campaign finance has become really out of control. And that gives them a lot of power on the politicians. So I think that's the issue. Now, to solve that, you need to have better campaign finance laws. But most of Europe has them already anyway.
I think we're not lagging there. We might be in a worse place in many other instances. But so because of I don't know, we only have a couple of minutes left, 4 minutes. For those who want to pose their question, just do so right now. But given the fact that we are all getting out, hopefully getting vaccinated out of this COVID situation, I think it's fitting to ask you a little bit about healthcare provision and healthcare provision in the US, and the fact that the US is the only industrialized country experiencing a decline in life expectancy. You did mention it in the book, I think, about maternal deaths, which are striking. It's to the level of the developing world in the US. It's just tragic to observe. But in Iceland, we have a national healthcare system, hence the state has a monopoly of healthcare, or buying healthcare from healthcare professionals. That is, to the large degree, doctors and nurses are more often than not government employees. Now, proponents of privatization in the healthcare sector, they gain momentum every now and then in Iceland. And so I wonder whether you want to take try to touch upon whether it isn't good to have competition work its magic in the healthcare provision. How is that different from markets of other goods and services? Why would we be wary of possibly competition or lack of competition in the healthcare sector?
So, so the case for the healthcare market, if you think about the basic economic theory and you make the list of all the features of a market that can lead to inefficient outcome, I think healthcare ticks all the boxes. And I think the only other market where you can think of where so obviously the private market would not be the solution would be like defense, something like that, or the police, where obviously we don't want to privatize the whole thing. But if you look at externalities, if you look at the risk for like the whole insurance is adverse selection, making sure everybody contributes. These are all the features we know that by itself the market would break down. So the unregulated healthcare market, that does not exist anywhere on earth. The only thing you have is badly regulated and well-regulated healthcare market. You do not have free healthcare market. That just never exists. It will never exist. It never existed before. So in the US, what you have is a badly regulated healthcare system. And in most of Europe, you have a better regulated healthcare system. That regulation itself is pretty much, I think it's almost orthogonal to whether it's public versus private. Because if you look at Europe and you look at the share of healthcare expenditure that is covered by private versus public insurance, it varies a lot, actually. It varies a lot. I mean, you have the UK or Iceland, which is like, essentially entirely government-based. You have Switzerland that has a mix. So I don't think private versus public is necessarily the most, as opposed to good versus bad regulation. The one thing that is true for sure, though, is that, and I think that's a point that Anne Case and Angus Deaton have made very forcefully in their last book, is that there is no healthcare system without price control. So, and to some extent, that's already telling you something about what I was saying earlier. This is the ultimate proof that it cannot work as a pure decentralized competitive market, because around the world, there is just no healthcare system that is affordable for everyone that does not include price control. So as soon as you put price control, you're going to have regulations. And I think that's a fact. Now, whether at the margin you want to privatize a bit the insurance part or not, that's all fine. You can discuss all of that. But at the end of the day, you're still going to have something like price control, and otherwise the costs go out of control and very unequal. The key feature of the US are two. The first is extremely unequal. So the fact that they have these bad statistics, it's all the poor people who die. And then for them, the outcomes are so much worse that they drag down the national average. So it's extremely unequal and it's very inefficient. Even for rich people, the rich people still get care in the US. And in fact, rich people get really good care in the US. They just pay twice as much as anybody else.
In Europe, yeah, exactly. Fascinating. I think we have to put an end to this now. Thank you so much, Thomas, for taking the time and to talk to us and sharing your insights with us. We would certainly have liked to keep it longer, but so much to discuss, so much to learn. Thanks to everybody who listened in on this, and to the organizers for setting up this wonderful event. Thank you so much.